It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. David Haward Bain has conducted prose and poetry workshops at Middlebury College since 1987 and has been associated with the distinguished Breadloaf Writers Conference since 1980. Mr. Bain is the prolific author of many magazine and newspaper articles, as well as more than 10 books, including The Old Iron Road, an epic of rails, roads, and the urge to go west. The title, Whose Woods Are These? A group portrait of celebrated writers in community, and of course, Empire Express, building the first Transcontinental Railroad. Empire Express was a main selection for the Book of the Month Club, a selection of the History Book Club and the Quality Paperback Book Club. It was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for History, a finalist for the Bancroft Prize from the Society of American Historians, and received the book prize from the New England Historical Association. In addition, it was a George W. and Constant W. Hilton Book Award for the National Railway and Locomotive History Society, and of course, a New York Times notable book. He is a prolific speaker, editor, and lecturer. He has a BS from Boston University and is an elected fellow in the Society of American Historians. A lifelong musician, playing R&B, blues, jazz, and some stride piano with the likes of John Lee Hooker, T-Bone Walker, and Bonnie Raitt, and many others in Boston, New York, and Vermont. Please join me in welcoming David Haward Bain.
Thank you all for being here. I'm just so psyched, so honored, so happy to be here, back in Utah again with a wonderful group of people, some old friends too. Let me just take a moment to thank Don Hartley and Don Oliver and Kevin Fales and Dina, of course, and Holly George, Alicia Rowley, all the wonderful sponsors who make this possible. Thanks from the bottom of my heart for that. Now the division, let me see, make sure I've got all my buttons ready here. The division suggested to me to go behind the scenes of researching and writing Empire Express. And so here is my personal view throughout, and I hope it will inspire you and all of us finding joy in our work, reminding us of why we're doing all of this. I have always lived within the sound of a train whistle. These were the opening words in my book, Empire Express, which occupied me for 14 years. At that moment I finished the book, it had filled 28% of my life. And the stakes had been high, even higher than I shall say today. So this is a narrative about inspiration, about hard work in the old style of our work, about passion and about survival, and about building something from the ground up, though standing, of course, on many invisible shoulders. The Utah Division of History invited me to escort you behind the scenes to take you into my life along on the journey of the Empire Express. I have 14 years of stories, but as Robert Frost once said, all the artist needs is a sample. To my fellow devotees of the Muse Clio, going behind these scenes is homage to what we all do and values we all share, and it's hoped, it's meant to inspire. This is a lunchtime talk, and there will be lots of slides, hopefully upping the visual value to go with the stories, and I am grateful and honored by your attention. Now, of course, yes, we're on the right one. Where am I? Still in Clio. Okay, there we go. I'll get it psyched. Synced. Now this was, of course, my first literary inspiration, so I pay homage to this book whenever I can. It's still my life inspiration in a lot of ways. Now, when I was growing up in South Jersey near Philadelphia and in Maryland near DC, my father worked for RCA in those days. The great bustling, echoing railroad stations I remember were Philly's 30th Street and Washington's Union Station. Later, moved to Long Island, I created vivid memories of New York's old, now long gone, Pennsylvania Station, which I was blessed to see before they tore it down, and of course Grand Central, always majestic, magical places. Now, I have to admit that at a certain point in my life, the perfect imagined job for me was as a cowpoke fireman. But twin steel rails could very well carry one off in other directions. My mom's parents lived in Kansas City, and we with her drove out or trained out every summer in the month of August. Here I am with Charles and Rose Haward, my grandparents. There I learned of old family railroad connections of the lower rung variety. Grandma Rose's father, an Irish immigrant in boyhood named Peter Donahue, he's in the left-hand picture and he's on the left there. That picture was taken in Atlanta in 1869 as he finished a Union Army hitch with his brother. So Peter labored grading railroads in northeastern Iowa and in the counties around Kansas City when he wasn't farming or grading new roads in Kansas City. Very hard life, very hard life. More railroads passing through my family tree, like that famous auto road cut through a gargantuan California redwood. My grandfather, Charles Haward, had a younger brother, little Ollie, who was tragically killed age 6 in Kansas City in 1900 when Oliver was caught up and run over by an eastbound 12th Street cable car in the intersection of 12th Street and Vine. Years later, you may remember a popular rock and roll tune, Going to Kansas City, memorialized 12th Street and Vine as a place to go with your Kansas City baby and your jug of Kansas City wine. But for the Haward boys, Ollie and older brother John, they had just been dispatched to the bakery for bread at dinner time, little Ollie brandishing the still warm bread through rush hour crowds. Now, another family railroad connection and mishap. Accident-prone family, I guess. My grandmother Rose's younger brother, Tom Donahue, he's on the left in this picture of 4 Donahue siblings, was a funny, gregarious great uncle, but as a little boy, I was fascinated that he only had one leg, always using a crutch. When Tom was a boy, he and his friends took to hitching rides on the Wabash freight cars in the train yard near the row house that they lived in, and Tom lost his grip leaping up on the ladder, losing his right leg just above the knee. Then for all of his life, Tom Donahue worked in Kansas City's Union Station for the Western Weighing and Inspection Bureau. Talk about always living within the sound of a train whistle. He has me beat. Now, not just in the family. As a kid, railroad imagery was everywhere. It was in my stamp collection, such as this 1944 commemorative, I still have it, for the 75th anniversary of the driving of the Golden Spike at Promontory. Movies saturated us all with train imagery like the old silence one could see on TV or at the public library, or as I did as a teen by renting them through the mail from Black Hawk Films. Or like all the modern day movies in the theaters or TV, like this still from North by Northwest. Ah, Eva Marie Saint. When I was young, trains were implanted in the culture, iconographic like the freight rail logos on boxcars. I saw track rumbling parallel to highways. They always held the romance of faraway places brought close. And here, in this picture, you could chart the places I lived before age 22 by the top row: the Pennsylvania, the Baltimore and Ohio, the New Jersey Central, the Long Island, and the Boston and Maine, the last of which I could see from my freshman dorm room window at Boston University, overlooking the B&M train yard with its all-day, all-night switch engines screeching as they move freight cars from track to track. Iconographic train posters spied through travel agency shop windows, seen on train station walls and punctuating platforms, and in all the media. Train imagery in every magazine that came into the house and stacked on the coffee table. Now, thanks to my parents, Rosemary and David Bain, and to my maternal grandparents, Rose and Charles Haward, I and my 3 siblings grew up in a wonderful cultural atmosphere of books, art, music, and for me especially, a growing love of history. My grandfather especially noticed this and fed the historical bug with yearly subscriptions to American Heritage, that bi-monthly hardcover magazine of historical essays and articles written in narrative style for the general reader by many of the nation's best historians, and sumptuously illustrated on substantial glossy paper. By then, I was reading well above my grade. I devoured them, reread them, and now I recognize was profoundly influenced in a literary way. And at the same time, I filled a shelf with volumes from the Landmark Books program, a Random House inspiration of publisher Bennett Cerf to make narrative history available to youthful readers. This book is, of course, both significant for my time and prescient for my future. So we better fast forward. Boston University journalism major, one of my poli-sci professors was Howard Zinn, long before his people's history. Then book publishing as a very junior editorial assistant at the still wondrous Alfred A. Knopf Incorporated, where, as an ink-stained wretch, still not out of the era of hot-type books with their yard-long galley proofs, at least we had electric typewriters on our desks and an armload of unsolicited manuscripts taken home every night and weekends looking for gold. As a junior editor working with authors and descending into the atomic level of their writings for up to a year until they're bound books, their research, their writing, their vision, I saw later it all seeped into me. I worked for senior editors Charles Eliot, late of the Old Life magazine, which had just folded, and Jane Garrett. Jane was later a friend up in Vermont for nearly 30 years, and she had the firm's record for editing and publishing the most Pulitzers and National Book Awards in history, just beating out another very supportive senior editor, Ashbel Green. They are my seraphim, along with their legion of archangel writers. In subsequent years after my 3 at Knopf, I was an editor at Stonehill and Crown Harmony, worked projects for Crown, Macmillan, and Houghton Mifflin, where I also wrote promotion copy. And then I went out on my own, still ink-stained with articles, reviews, first book. I got married, I published another book, and I began a third. The big break was Sitting in Darkness from Houghton Mifflin Publishers in 1984. It was a hybrid about 2 eras, part rigorously researched narrative history, part historical present-day travel memoir about the forgotten colonial war the U.S. fought in the Philippines, 1898 to 1902. It featured 2 major characters, General Frederick Funston and his Filipino nemesis, General Emilio Aguinaldo, and the momentous capture of the latter by the former in 1901. So braided into this story was my own, leading my own expedition of 5 friends to duplicate Funston's famous trek up the rugged northeast coast of Luzon. The narratives alternated chapter by chapter, producing an eerie effect of my catching up with the pursued, though they had an 81-year head start. So Sitting in Darkness did pretty well critically and commercially. And I guess you could say, for them, it put me on a map. Not just the modern-day mountainous, jungled Isabella province, but the publishing one. So I'm very grateful to that book. So an editor at Viking Press, owned by England's Penguin Books, contacted me after reading reviews and feature articles about my expedition to the Philippines and into historical antecedents. Would you be interested, editor Amanda Vale asked me at lunch one day, if we commissioned you to write a book on the first Transcontinental Railroad? Somewhere deep in the neural tunnels of my brain, a whistle sounded. Ooh. Now, Amanda didn't know when the last book on the subject had been published, but I found out at the library the next day that there had been 3 last books on the subject. 2 had been published in 1962, some of you may own these books. one in 1964, which was 21 years before I looked them up and checked them out. The three publishers, G.P. Putnam's and Sons, McGraw-Hill, and Harper and Row, were no doubt mindful of the upcoming Golden Spike Centennial in 1969. As far as I can see, though, all three were forgotten by the stores and out of print by the big May 10th day in '69. Now, they weren't terrible books. They were workmanlike efforts by journeyman magazine writers. The three told the same stories, a number of which I later learned were untrue. And they were 98% based, I'd estimate, on earlier books on the subject, easily seen by perusing or studying, in my case, their hardly helpful endnotes and scant bibliographies. No help there, so it would be starting afresh as I'd done with my Philippine research. So, into the magnificent research facilities of the New York Public Library's main branch welcomed me, as it had for more than 4 years with Sitting in Darkness. Those golden banks of card catalog file drawers awaited me in my yellow pads years before personal computers, more than a decade before the advent of the internet, some 20 years before the world's greatest campaign of digitizing print books, then photographs, and then maps, and then entire archives before that had come into place. Aided also, beyond those hundreds of catalog drawers, were the gigantic green cloth volumes of the National Union Catalog, the old pre-1956 NUC, as we called it, National Union Catalog, and the equally formidable National Union Catalog of Manuscript Collections, or as we like to call it, the NUCMUC. NUCMUC, helping me find where treasures were shelved or filed around the country. Other methods took me into scholarship of modern times between 1956 and 1985. So a couple of train rides, of course, down to DC and the exquisite jewel that is the America's Library of Congress continued the planning for work ahead. Besides its books, pamphlets, and government reports, there was the Prints and Photographs Division and the Maps Division. Back at home, in 3 months, I reported to Viking that I had a serviceable start on a bibliography, a chapter and a narrative outline, a list of the dramatis persona, and a path forward. It was supposed to take me 5 years. It took me 14. The story I felt anointed to tell just kept getting better, and it kept compelling me on. Where to begin? It had to start with the dreamers before getting to the doers, and it became clear that the sprawling narrative of 3 decades of 19th century history would begin with one man, Asa Whitney. Now, I had a problem imagining what he looked like, but a squib in an 1840s newspaper said that the Connecticut-born merchant looked so much like the late Napoleon that whenever business took Whitney to Paris, people would constantly stop him in the street to annoy him because of the resemblance. So that gave me an image to start with, but I had a problem with the Emperor General's greatcoat, the medals, and the hidden hand. Having spent decades frequenting Washington, and finally, when his campaign was over, retiring to a Maryland farm just outside the district, somehow Asa Whitney had never been importuned inside the photograph studios of the great Matthew Brady or Alexander Gardner. They managed to capture the likenesses of every other celebrated person in his heyday. And in his heyday, Whitney certainly inspired many, many headlines. With his clever, visionary railroad proposal, his indefatigable energy and oratorical majesty to build a national railway from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. Finally, though, around the time I was poking around the University of Michigan library, following a lead to uncover the Asa Whitney papers, mostly his personal diary, never used by anyone before, that I found a print of the elder Napoleon that worked all right with my imagination. Reading his forlorn diary entries as he leaned over a ship's rail, brooding across the South Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, I followed him heading for China and hopefully a new purchase on life, made miserable by losing his wife and child to illness and being ruined in a financial panic. The voyage was excruciatingly slow even for the 1840s, but Whitney's broodings took him into an audacious plan to use the newest technology, the railroad train, to, as he would write, annihilate distance and find a way for the U.S. to become a major commercial player in the world by shortening such long voyages around Africa or South America to link to the opportunities in Asia. More than 30 years later, I remember typing dozens of pages, transcribing his handwritten diary from faint microfilm. His words, urgent, passionate, personal, brought him and his era alive. Newspapers with their generous reportings of his lecture tours vivified it all, and all the competitive dreamers with their competing transcontinental routes across the still mostly unsettled Midwest and Far West were drawn into my spotlight too. So the diary didn't look like this, of course, but I must have my whimsy in my illustration, so there I go. So in downtown DC, the National Archives was already familiar hunting grounds in those years before the satellite repositories had come into their own. Government documents, reports, publications, correspondence fit into the story. One of my most important archives was the Nebraska State Historical Society in Lincoln. For its many drawers of microfilm of the Union Pacific records, letters, telegrams, reports, field notes, truly a monumental collection gathered from numerous sources. Limited funding in this long project forced my on-site research to a minimum, not to forget the many rolls of dimes I fed into photocopy machines, but then now I can say hallelujah and hosanna for the nation's interlibrary loan program, which at the New York Public Library or my succeeding home institution, Middlebury College in Vermont, where my wife and I moved in 1987. Now here I got to know Dr. Thomas Clark Durant, a lapsed ophthalmologist. He was widely known by associates and underlings as the doctor. Never, never doc, for God's sake. He schemed his way through business circles and into the top echelon of the Union Pacific Railroad, which had been anointed in 1862 as the official railroad to build westward from the Missouri River at Council Bluffs, Omaha. Durant was a driving, cruel taskmaster and just as crooked as they come. I got to know his handwriting very well with all the telegrams, letters, and deals he generated, all to feather his own nest in one way or another. Here he's facing the UP's chief engineer, Grenville Dodge, a brigadier general in the Union Army before returning to his chief calling, railway surveying and engineering, along with taking all the side bets and deals he could. Dr. Durant fired him several times, like in this telegram, but Dodge was too powerfully connected in Washington and kept coming back. Now, reading the 19th century penmanship was a prerequisite I'd already earned. Though Grenville Dodge gets the award for the worst handwriting in this 30-year saga. Mr. Dodge, I just feel like a teacher telling him to go back and do it again. More legible in those countless Nebraska microfilms was that of Jack Casement, the UP construction chief, who wrote poignant letters home to his wife. Also legible was Samuel Reed, UP locating engineer, who also wrote warm letters back home, describing the work pressures from the doctor, the corruption all around him, the dangers to his surveyors out well beyond the end of track, and of course how much he missed his wife and kids. Beautiful things. In Vermont, I kept the Middlebury College interlibrary loan personnel busy for more than 10 years with my microfilm and book requests arriving in the mail by the 3 or 4 a few weeks after my order was transmitted. On the faculty, with a generous allowance for copying, I would press a print 100 times, later marking the pages up with yellow highlighter and ballpoint notes. All in all, I'd award the Nebraska State Historical Society first prize for the amount of material it delivered to me and keeping up with my pace of orders. Now, I discovered a treasure trove of material, tons of letters, piles of letters, some in code, piles of telegrams, some in code, from the other major contender of the Transcontinental, the Central Pacific Railroad of Sacramento, California. It anointed to build east from the California capital through the formidable Sierra Nevada mountains and across Nevada. Surprisingly, the collection wasn't in California, but Syracuse, New York. Woven into those hundreds of thousands of words were the lives and personalities of 6 men. Theodore Judah, engineer; Collis Huntington, vice president; Leland Stanford, president; Mark Hopkins, treasurer; Charles Crocker, construction chief; and brother Edwin Crocker, attorney and superintendent. I did a few trips out there to hold their letters in my white cotton-gloved fingers with growing excitement. But a microfilm edition of the papers plus interlibrary loans proved easier on my budget. Now, Collis Huntington was, in my words, a shrewd shark of a businessman, a genius back in his hardware store at turning a dime into 15 cents, and in the Central Pacific Railroad, $1 million into 2. He was almost always out east, making deals for the Central Pacific, ordering equipment, selling company stocks and bonds, and bribing congressmen, just like Dr. Duran of the UP. So pictured here is a letter written by Leland Stanford, like all their colleagues, a founder of the state Republican Party and a future governor and senator. One cannot avoid commenting that of the CP directorate, Stanford was the lazy one, all windy talk and not much action. Someone likened him to a locomotive upside down with the wheels spinning. So he was, of course, made president of the company. Of course. Here's a letter from Mark Hopkins to Huntington in Uncle Mark's, he was called Uncle Mark, in his careful, readable hand. He had a kind of a quiet wisdom that I really enjoyed. Now, Charlie Crocker supervised construction through an entity called the Contract and Finance Company. As a brawny man of action, how did he not go crazy selling millinery in his Sacramento shop before his great chance came along? So Charlie Crocker scribbled his letters, and he had a very bluff, sometimes aggressive way about him. He chiefly bossed his men roughly, though his next in command over the laborers was a certified bully. Now I tell you though, Charlie's brother Ed, or E.B. Crocker, it was like night and day. E.B. was not only a lawyer but an engineer. Huntington, out east most of the time, knew much about the company's business, but E.B. knew literally everything. He expended more energy and willpower than anyone else, which ultimately would drive him into a paralyzing stroke, a lingering, and finally death. His letters to Huntington were well written, erudite, and persuasive, done in a beautiful hand, and they were 8, 10, 12, 14, 18 pages long. E.B. became for me the greatest source for the Central Pacific story, my hero of that part of the story, in fact. And it's always irritated me that his illness encouraged the others, his friends and associates, to hog the limelight and sway the traditional story to Ed's diminishment. So Syracuse's collection, Collis P. Huntington papers, so crucial, so voluminous, must share my first prize awarded Nebraska. It's only fair. Now, interestingly, when Huntington died at 79 in New York, pretty much the last of the group to go, his trunks of business papers languished for some awful time until one of his family members, over her grief, she was over it, was donating some other stuff, non-connected stuff, to Syracuse University, and as an afterthought, she threw in all of Collis's trunks of railroad business documents and hundreds of letters. Truly a miracle it survived. Now, just a little view behind the curtain. When there's no finding aid available, you have to do your own. So my indexing of the Syracuse Huntington letters looked like that, first on yellow pads, then typed and formatted, so I could go in the writing and utilize them as fully as possible, because think of all the things that could be talked about in an 18-page letter. It was at the University of Iowa that I felt I came to know Dr. Thomas C. Durant the best, and the slippery, mysterious Credit Mobilier construction arm of the railroad. Now, even more of his letters, his notes, his telegrams had all been vacuumed up by an avid collector of railroadiana, God bless him, one Levi O. Leonard, who worked at Iowa and several Western universities. That he wheedled them out of the Adirondack home storeroom of Durant's widow in the 1920s to archival safety, even in Iowa, is another miracle. So if Durant hadn't died, he would have burned them, certainly. Now, among many treasures at the Bancroft Library on the University of California, Berkeley campus were the papers of Central Pacific's progenitor, Theodore Judah, the engineer who surveyed the Sierra Nevada and found a practicable route over the summit along the old Donner Party path from 1846. After his break with the five associates, Huntington, Stanford et al., and his heading back to the east to find new partners to buy them all out, Judah died of typhoid, contracted while crossing the isthmus. His devoted wife, Anna, never got over the loss, but she memorialized her husband in collecting his notes and adding her long manuscript of his accomplishments. Also at the Bancroft, there was the Collis Huntington manuscript, typescript of a long interview with the then elderly but still irascible mogul. You can imagine his voice. "We never had any aid. I borrowed all the money myself. I borrowed much of it from my personal friends. I got a great deal from outside banks. Most of them knew me. All of those men I had known for years and had great faith in me. And I went over the mountains." All in all, with these voices fixed on foolscap. Nice phrase I came up with there, anyway. Fixed on foolscap. The library's extraordinary collection of maps and photographs and ephemera, I've awarded the second place prize to the Bancroft. My many missions there reach back nearly 40 years now, and the staff has a warm place in my heart. There's Collis with his manuscript. Okay, now, smaller but unique manuscript collections at Stanford University Library. After the railroads, after the State House and the U.S. Senate, Leland Stanford tended to the university he and his wife founded in memory of their son and his untimely death, notably for my purpose containing the documents from the home office of Mark Hopkins and from the papers of Leland Stanford, unduplicated in the much larger trove at Syracuse. Now, when I first researched in Sacramento's California State Library, it was still in the old Quartz building, looking pretty much like this postcard from the 1930s or 40s. But I must have been there the first time in 85 or 86. What drew me was the overlooked A.P. Catlin papers. Attorney Amos Catlin, a pal of Theodore Judah's when the latter surveyed and supervised the first railroad on the Pacific Slope, the Sacramento Valley Railroad. Then later catching what everybody called the Pacific Railroad bug, and not only finding the route, but then in D.C., Judah maneuvering himself into an office in the Capitol and then into the pivotal job of Secretary for the Congressional Pacific Railroad Committee, writing major parts of the 1862 law, establishing the Union Pacific and appointing the Central Pacific into the deal. Thank goodness those things don't happen anymore. Thank goodness. Catlin kept Judah's miscellaneous California papers, letters to Anna Judah from his roughshod reconnaissance trips over the summit, and his journal. My later trips to the library had me in the beautiful modern edifice making use of the extraordinary card index of local Pacific Slope newspapers and the plethora of mounted clippings from the 1860s. Not only the Union, but the papers of Colfax, Grass Valley, Dutch Flat, every little gold rush town had its own proud little journal. Definitely third prize for the historical jewels found there, heroically card indexed and mounted by all those anonymous librarians, God bless them. Huzzah to every single one of them. So many sites deserving thanks, and I would definitely be remiss in not mentioning my trips to Salt Lake City, not to forget subsequent lectures, talks, keynotes, Weber State, the Utah Railroad Museum, including a C-SPAN taping and, of course, Promontory a number of times. 5, I think. But here in this fair city, indebtedness redoundeth to the University of Utah Library, the Utah State Historical Society, and to the Salt Lake City Public Library. There still echoes the happiness of finally being able to track down a third-hand purported threat from Brigham Young against the Union Pacific's Grenville Dodge, which a transcript in the Deseret News showed to be a pretty mild expression of disappointment in the Union Pacific Railroad. On that score, I could correct the record as established by another writer, a friend of mine, he taken in by Dodge's self-aggrandizement once again. That's okay, we all have at one time or another. Now, a few remarks. Oh, did I do that whole thing like that? Oh my goodness, look at these beautiful pictures. And there's the Rio Grande where we were last night. So anyway, and it's, for me, it was an uncharacteristic picture of Brigham, so I wanted to put that one in too. Okay, I'm going to move on here. A few remarks about narrative focus on the literary side and scholarship on the other. Thinking as I was back in the mid-late 80s to the end of the 90s, how big should this stage be? And with how many characters, how many plot threads, and how to be responsible to history, to all peoples. Those 3 previous popularized books on the Transcontinental, not serious from a scholarly point of view, but having an incalculable influence in the culture. They shared a simple, unambiguous cultural outlook about, for instance, Native Americans, in an impulse to foster a triumphalist air. They were savages whose depredations against railroad surveyors, track constructors, train crews, civilians came from nowhere. Just they had no source that needed to be understood other than from the standpoint of cultural superiority. So I'll add another book appearing in 1988 with even more of that perspective, but also so ridden with errors of every type that my shelf copy seethes with angry underlinings and marginal comments. Here I go, a condition shared by its companion on my shelf. But I'll leave that for another day. I'll leave that for later, another day. Probably life's too short for that kind of catalog. Truly true. Now, as all of you know, I'm sure, scholarship on Native Americans proliferated from the late 1960s on into the 70s, 80s, and beyond, a veritable cornucopia of fact-correcting, attitude-correcting work, from which I was a grateful worker bee. Andrist, Grinnell, Larson, Giuseppe, D. Brown, George Hyde, and others, of course, from that time of blossoming. And Patty Limerick, of course, from 87 on, Richard White in 83 and 91, and others. Acknowledging them all. So the story of the Transcontinental Railroad had to widen, it had to deepen, and not just being mindful about the leaders, Spotted Tail, Red Cloud, and Washakie, for instance, or Sheridan Custer, Shivington, Patrick Connor, but the children, the women, the impatient young men waiting for their opportunity, being mindful of that on both sides, both sides. Inquiring minds want to know. I couldn't find that anyone had done the math, so I pulled out a calendar from 1864, 65, 67, or 68, and I did a timeline. And so it became clear that only a few days' ride on horseback connected the massacre of a peaceful, reconciliatory tribal encampment at Sand Creek in Colorado Territory and the raids on railroad surveyors in western Nebraska, eastern Wyoming, or between the openly genocidal military actions of General Patrick Connor and the hapless, long-suffering village of Plum Creek, Nebraska, again reduced to ashes along with a Union Pacific work and supply train. All the same story along with national and local politics, the evolution of American business. It was all the same story. Now, some of it, even about Dodge, even about Sheridan, whom I'm supposedly related to on my mother's side. Maybe there's an essay there. Spilled over into my next book. Definitely spilled over into my next book. Another subject to be followed in research and writing back in those Empire Express 80s and 90s. An issue flubbed by the 3 Transcontinental books of the 1960s, and as a matter of fact, the 2 later ones I briefly mentioned, was that of the Central Pacific's Chinese workers. Obviously, it needed to lose those works' cultural superiority and triumphalism. Scholarship lagged there at that time, since blooming into a proliferation of work the past 18 years after my publication. But I'm still hoping someone will discover an archive of interviews done in the U.S. with elderly Chinese laborers, former laborers, such as the Union Pacific did with their old-timers, their Caucasian old-timers in the 1920s, a marvelous, overlooked resource that I found. Or such as what the work, on another subject, the Works Progress Administration did in the 1930s, documenting the surviving slave narratives. Extraordinary work. Worse are odds for archives or even individual manuscripts in Guangdong Province, formerly Canton, in China, where many of the California Chinese retired to live in relative splendor. But in my narrative of Empire Express, continuing in my successor book, one sees the roots of the racism and exclusion of the late 19th and 20th century, even of today's nativism, echoes of racism and exclusion. Now, another important issue of the Transcontinental story, skirted or ignored by those other named books, or simplified, but one essential to who we were as a nation and who we are as a nation, was the credit mobilia scandal of 1872 and 73. Outside of the triumphalist feat of linking the eastern and the western shores of the continent with twin bands of iron, it exposed bold, cynical corruption between the Union Pacific Railroad and its construction arm, the Credit Mobilier of America, and members of Congress, along with many other unindicted co-conspirators in other walks of life, which roiled the country for well over a year and all but paralyzed the national government. Here, 2 principal faces: Congressman Oakes Ames, brother of the UP president — Ames was the sacrificial fall guy — and Schuyler Colfax, golden boy vice presidential candidate with the revered savior of the Union, U.S. Grant. The Golden Boy's political traction would never be the same, possibly a loss to the country, but who knows? Not only was it a crackling good story, thanks to crusading journalists and self-righteous politicians. Who, me? Outrageous. But it not only summed up the political landscape of the previous 30 years in that story, the 1840s to 1870s, but forecast so much of the next 140 years. So, of course, it would be in the book as an epilogue. And so the research and the writing went on. I think I can, I think I can, I think I can. As my own personal track went from Brooklyn, New York to Middlebury, Shoreham, and then finally Orwell, Vermont. Now let me describe blessed life and fortunate work in the bounteous Champlain Valley of Vermont, the Shire town of Middlebury, and the town's college, as early boosters called it. I chose and defended part-time work, eschewing tenure track, full-time meetings, and committee work, so my writing life would not be confined for all intents and purposes to summers and periodic leaves. So as this calendar I just made up shows, Tuesdays and Thursdays I taught 1 writing workshop course, nonfiction, fiction, poetry, environmental writing, and held office hours. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays I worked on the railroad all the livelong day. Nights and weekends devoted to my beautiful wife, Mary, a talented artist and administrator of the college's Women's Center, and our glorious children, Mimi, born in 1988. I almost said 18, honey. I do this all the time. You will see me do this all the time in this. And our son, Davy, born in 1992. Truly, a blessed life and work even abounded. We got through difficulties, including cancer scares for both me in the fall of '96 and Mary in spring '97, and our growing children were our light. Now, I kept in touch with my editors in New York, Like many writers, I had a succession of editors. Since the publishing industry is a revolving door, and editorial folks are forever seeking a better place. And so I mailed off chapters as finished to warm reception, thank goodness, and patience as all the years went by beyond the first, the second, and the third deadline. My progress was praised, excitement expressed for what it would be, encouragement. By then, in year, I had advanced the written narrative to July 1867, a scene in Nebraska involving Samuel Benedict Reed and his worries about Dr. Durant and getting adequate numbers of ties and rails and keeping his track workers from harm in the periodic raids. Then it was December 1998, and an English departmental colleague hurried over to me one day in the faculty lunchroom. "David," he said, "I've got terrible news." I reflexively thought, well, can't be worse than a cancer diagnosis. "What's up?" I responded. "Well, I was watching Charlie Rose last night," my friend said, "and Stephen Ambrose was the guest, and Ambrose said his next book was going to be on the first Transcontinental Railroad." That's not actually the painting, that's me. A mental montage of my 13 years of work flashed and slashed through my mind. I was about to endure the worst train wreck of my life. Instantly, it was like bucolic Middlebury and my friend faded away, and there I was stoically and hopefully pumping away on a handcar out of the Sierra and down to the Truckee Meadows, making better and better time now, getting out on the edge of the 40-mile desert of Nevada, pumping away and doing quite well, though suddenly I felt a rumbling, a shaking beneath my boots, and turned around, seeing through dust a form. Was it Thomas the Tank Engine? No, it wasn't Smiling Thomas. It was Stephen Ambrose. It was the rumbling, smoke-belching Ambrose Limited, and he was not smiling. Rather, he looked very predatory, cold-eyed, getting closer, closer. And my little handcar and my hard work mattered not. I called my agent, Ellen. I called my editor, Catherine. I called my publisher, Barbara. I went to see my dean. I went to see my president, college president, another historian. Over a couple of days, we all conferred. I had reached July 1867 in the narrative. Ambrose had barely started, had his squad of researchers, including family members, and had begun to pore over their stack of secondary sources. I had drawers, shelves, and boxes of raw material highlighted, underlined, transcribed, indexed, charted, and each future chapter's material grouped and ready. I could get from 1867 to the 1869 Golden Spike in 7 chapters. And then an epilogue for the 1873 scandals, and thus to the end. We could beat the Ambrose Limited for whatever modest or life-saving benefit that might bring me. The arrangement became Viking Penguin would buy me out of my college contract for a year, and departmental colleagues or other outside writer friends would take my scheduled classes. And Middlebury would take me back afterward, letting me finish my current 3-year contract and hopefully proceed from there. I and my beautiful family could survive this, and they could cope with my drastic change of my weekly schedules, so I could step out of part-time immersion in the 1860s, and I could step fully into the 19th century, write 7 days a week, and so I did. And my Mary was strong, and our Mimi and Davy were resourceful, and off I went in my mental time machine. I think I can, I think I can, I think I can. Chapters 26 27, 28, 29. Rising before dawn, I wrote my editor and publisher on February 2nd, and having the time of my life. And in March 10th, 1998, I've written more in 8 weeks than I was able to manage in 8 months last year, or indeed in any year-long period for quite some time. The editor told me in March they hope to publish in fall 99, the 130th anniversary of the Golden Spike. I see that by July 3rd, I had finished 27 of 32 chapters. That letter reminded me, reading that letter reminded me that in a fit of paranoia in January, I had stopped supplying footnotes in the manuscript chapters I was sending to the editors, as if a secretary at Viking might be compromised by operatives of Simon & Schuster, considered in the publishing world then as rapacious, ruthless, and territorial, or even moles of the Ambrose family. I had a hiding place for my manuscript at home, too. Of course, 14 years of someone else's work and footnotes would have never interested them or happened, so don't have to think about that. I thought I could. Chapters 30, 31, 32, and the epilogue. September 25th, up to chapter 30 mailed in, and I was hoping to finish around November 15th, a month before deadline. November 5th, letter to my editor, chapter 31 of 32 completed. Today at 4:59, I wrote on November 18th, 1998, I wrote my editor, my publisher, and my agent, I drove the Golden Spike. I have a few more pages of national tumult to record, ending the sequential narrative. The scandalous epilogue, though, would not be in by Thanksgiving, a few weeks more. Actually, it would be on January 5th, 1999 that I finished. And so the familiar, much visited editorial process started again for me, the editing, copy editing, proofing, designing. The salesmen were really happy after their big annual December meeting. Next November would be the date, and just before Christmas. The cover designer's first take was scrapped, and he began his winning design. Given the timely and generous support given me by the house, the chapters sent down over that 14-year span, especially in that pulse-pounding year we just finished, I expected it would be free of surprises. It was anything but. The next 2 months was absolute hell. Despite the publisher's support and expressions of confidence in coming success, despite the looming competition from ruthless Simon & Schuster and its brand name historian, the message didn't penetrate the two little Viking editorial offices where the project would be launched. Suddenly, the name Viking no longer seemed stalwart, nor the name Penguin cute and dignified, even cuddly, but bloodthirsty, like a meat cleaver, which is what they used for editing. My editor, an old friend, was distracted with elderly and sick parents back home in England. She delegated the line editing, something over the decades has never been a problem for me, to her assistant, very bright, schooled like her boss in England, originally from Pakistan. Neither had grown up in the culture of the United States nor breathed in the history, which may or may not have had a factor in this. But in fact, neither had shepherded a history book through the process, and really, nonfiction is not my thing, is something that I heard from both of them. So anyway, sometimes these things happen. The editing result, alas, could have ruined my health, and it did cost us nearly 2 months in an already squeezed, tight schedule. Diplomacy on my part became an edict. I was ready to walk Viking and find a more hospitable home. Wiser corporate heads prevailed, including a CEO who'd been very supportive. I'd already cut 300 pages from the manuscript in the past year, and then before that in the past 5 years. Plenty of serious, well-selling books of length were published every year. We buckled down, the hatchet, or the meat cleaver, was buried. I got a good copy editor, the bibliography and endnotes were polished until they shined. The advance orders were good, sales and promotion, signed on to a 2-week media tour. And we did okay. I hope you realize that what I have here is a survival narrative, a story about believing, about hope and hard work, and about insisting on what had been agreed was a worthy vision. But despite the behind-the-curtains tumult, the book did do very well in the late summer and autumn reviews. 45 or 50 reviews is the number, I believe. There were prize nominations, prizes, a fellowship, some documentaries, a lot of commission talks, lectures, and slideshows. And all the people, whether a person or letters. I met great-granddaughters of Charles Crocker after a talk at the Smithsonian, a descendant of Huntington at the Railroad Museum in Sacramento, here in Salt Lake City, a descendant of Dr. Durant, and a grandson of Bishop Chauncey West, God bless him, in the King's English store right here. And hundreds of people with iron in their blood and steam in their nostrils from their ancestor who worked on the railroad. I didn't get rich or very much more secure, but it was indeed a great event, as the Golden Spike posters had said. I was privileged to have gotten it right, in my own vision at least, and that was good. But how to thank my wife Mary and my children, Mimi, now 11, and Davy, now 8, who had lived with a father in a time machine for a year, who had been obsessed with his mission for 14 years. I did not take them to Disneyland. Instead, I planned a grand excursion out west, conceived during a 2-week book tour, as I took all the jets and little puddle jumpers over the very mountains, deserts, plains, lakes, and rivers I'd been writing about. Glued to the window on every plane, our geography etched into my brain, tracing Route 80 and thus near enough to the original Transcontinental route. A book proposal got me in advance. A college faculty grant helped substantially with expenses, and over the winter of 99-2000, I accounted for the route and every day of a 2.5-month automobile trip for the 4 of us. From the Missouri River at Council Bluffs, Omaha, we would try to stay on state, county, and town roads, though some were extremely rough, rutted, and dusty, and we would follow the routes of the Transcontinental, and also, as they were all braided together, the California Trail, the Mormon Pioneer Trail, sections of the Oregon, the Lincoln Highway, as they braided 1,700 miles parallel to Route 180. The route having many diversions, completing a number of circles, doubling back several times for various reasons. We drove from Orwell, Vermont to San Francisco and Santa Cruz and put 7,000 miles on the car, one way. In our brand new SUV, a Dodge which we named Grenville. Coming in for a landing here. Aside from our own travel narrative, 4 family members immersing in history, again, I call it a historical travel narrative, I would braid in the old stories, so many that figured in the Empire Express narrative, but so many more that fell outside of that 30-year time frame. Examples. This was a place for yarns. Discovery of copious dinosaur fossils in Wyoming shale by Union Pacific laborers. Mark Twain crossing the continent on a stagecoach. Nebraska, Wyoming, Utah to the Nevada silver mines in his eventual writing career. Buffalo Bill, hunter, fighter, pageant impresario, retired to see to his affairs, literally, in his mansion in North Platte with the secret door in his bedroom. Willa Cather's girlhood home in tiny Red Cloud, Nebraska, and crooner film star Bing Crosby on his Nevada ranch, Don't Fence Me In. Owen Wister, witnessing events in Medicine Bow, Wyoming that would engender his great novel, The Virginian. Cattle Kate, criminally lynched for rustling in the Laramie Mountains. Ed Perkins, inventor of Kool-Aid in Hastings, Nebraska. Mary Donner, emigrant with her family and trapped in Sierra snows. Film star Henry Fonda, raised in Grand Island, Nebraska. And aviatrix hero Amelia Earhart, raised in Atchison, Kansas, and who once landed her autogyro aircraft in Rock Springs, Wyoming on a promo tour for Beech Nut Chewing Gum. I kid you not. This braided and personal story was, as I see now, my second greatest writer's opportunity in a career, and I'm very thankful for that. And I think that I've reached the end I certainly had plenty of pictures, but time being what it is, oh, that's Don Snoddy there with the wig, with the scalp, et cetera, et cetera. This takes us on a long journey. Don't get dizzy. I'll just do it in like a minute's time. And there we are. So thank you for your attention.